Welcome everybody. So today is our first webinar of the series, and we'll be talking about corporate governance for SMEs. I'm happy to introduce Christos Christou, who is a senior industrial advisor with our international advisory program, who's been a board member of multiple companies over the years, working on the corporate governance issues. Christos is also not new to the EBRD, and he's been with the bank longer than most of us. And recently, Christos also wrote a book about corporate and family governance, and we had a privilege to see the cover. The book is coming up very soon. So we have prepared a number of questions, but to start with, could you maybe briefly introduce yourself and tell us what is not covered in our interest, and tell us for how long have you been involved with corporate governance issues?
I've been involved in corporate governance for nearly 25 years. I joined the EBRD in the early 90s and was a senior banker and also a deputy director for the Baltics team and also head of the ship finance unit. And the bank was already in those days promoting the introduction of corporate governance in its countries of operation and the companies that it was working with. I have served on a number of boards over the years, a dozen companies, as an independent non-executive director. Some of these companies were more established and some were more early stage. Usually it was on behalf of financial investors like the EBRD, and the companies covered a broad spectrum of industries, also across different countries, including the UK, Lithuania, Belgium, Tunisia, and Slovenia. In the last 10 years, I have also been involved in advising relating to corporate governance. I have a lot of materials that I have prepared, which have been put online and are available for free. And I'm about, as you mentioned, to publish a book on the topics of corporate and family governance.
Before we start with the content, it's always good to have like a common definition. So how do you define corporate governance?
Yes, I think that is very important. And I would say there are two broad aspects of corporate governance. The first concerns arrangements between shareholders, management, and the oversight body, which is usually a board of directors, which supervises the management on behalf of the shareholders. And the second concerns functions and policies and the culture that allow effective direction and control by the board on behalf of the shareholders and also the broader stakeholders. So both aspects are in fact about direction and control. And starting with the first aspect that concerns the shareholders, the management, and the board of directors, we have on the one hand the shareholders that are the owners who provide the capital for the business. Then we have the managers that are the people who implement the strategy of the business with the capital of the owners and basically run the business on a day-to-day basis. And then the third set of people are the directors or the oversight body who act as the people who not only formulate the strategy, but also supervise the managers, whilst at the same time, they are also themselves answerable to the owners. And the rules of engagement between these three sets of people are at the core of corporate governance, and the arrangements by which the shareholders appoint the directors, the terms of reference and the powers of the oversight body are the first crucial part of corporate governance. But corporate governance doesn't stop there. It also includes all the functions and policies and the culture that allow this oversight body to provide their direction and to exercise the control. So it includes the strategic and business planning, risk management, compliance and internal audit, reporting and monitoring functions. And all these functions and the policies that a company adopts to carry out these functions are essentially dealing with matters like the allocation, and the utilization and the safeguarding of resources for the benefit of the company and its shareholders. Last, but by no means least, in my view, is the culture of the organization. And by culture, I mean the shared values, the shared attributes and expectations and practices that basically characterize the interactions and the actions of company members between themselves and with external parties. The corporate governance as an umbrella that covers all these other functions, and the culture is the thing that binds everything together. So in my view, corporate governance is about having the commitment and the discipline to certain good principles that and habits that enhance the prospects of a company.
What are the critical components?
The most critical ingredient for corporate governance to exist and to be meaningful is the genuine commitment from the owners and the top management.
Right, thank you. Can we maybe start talking about corporate governance and SMEs? What
Yes.
are the benefits for the SMEs to have corporate governance, and what are the risks of the company carry if they don't have a proper corporate governance system in place?
Well, the short answer is that corporate governance matters for companies of all sizes, including SMEs, because in the final analysis, corporate governance aims to safeguard a company's prospects and to protect it from risks, from existential threats, and even from failure. So it stands to reason that all companies benefit from having corporate governance, irrespective of their size. And that is because corporate governance, good corporate governance, ensures there is a clear definition of the roles, the duties, the rights, and the expectations for employees, for managers, directors, and shareholders. And this benefits the business itself, whatever the size, including SMEs. So in my view, corporate governance enhances the prospects of longevity of a small, medium-sized enterprise, and it also increases its potential for growth to an even bigger company. What is also interesting is that the converse is also true. So if there is no corporate governance, or corporate governance is failing, this can undermine a company's capacity to absorb shocks and its resilience, and it therefore increases the risk of business distress and failure. And I would like to say that in my experience, a lot of SMEs actually practice at least rudimentary corporate governance without even describing it as corporate governance, because there are aspects of corporate governance that are simple common sense, particularly when it comes to checks and balances. For example, if you take a successful confectionery business, usually it makes sure that what they sell is fresh and not stale. It is good business and it's simple, but it's effective corporate governance. If the same business has 5 shops and also sells to supermarkets, then the dimensions of corporate governance, of course, multiply, and much more thought needs to go into it. So sometimes it's a matter of encouraging SMEs to look at what they're doing and expand it and codify it and formalize it so it is more effective and meaningful. And to bring home a specific benefit of good corporate governance that is linked to finance, I should note that increasingly, capital providers of all types, including banks and investors, recognize that good corporate governance means less risk for them as lenders or investors, and that poor or no corporate governance means more risk for them. And so taking 2 SMEs, which are in the same industry, the same country, and of similar size, the one which is perceived as practicing better corporate governance will have most likely greater access to capital, and most likely also at better terms. So the SME with a better corporate governance will have better chances of growth and of continued success.
Thank you. As you know, we work across many countries, 30 countries, and across many industries. And it feels that like a good corporate governance system would look different in different countries and in different sectors and in different industry. Is there one size fit all? It feels like it doesn't exist. So what is your view on that?
Yeah, no, you're right. When it comes to corporate governance, there is no one size that fits all. Corporate governance needs to be tailored to the specific circumstances that relate to specific SMEs. So there are a number of factors that need to be taken into consideration in order to design and introduce corporate governance that is fit for purpose in different circumstances. In order to be effective and meaningful, corporate governance needs to be tailored to the circumstances of the company concerned. And of course, as the circumstances change, corporate governance should also evolve to reflect that and to ensure that it remains effective and it remains meaningful. So, for example, when it comes to deciding what is an appropriate oversight body for an SME, personally, I feel there is a ladder of options, starting from advisory boards for earlier stage companies, lower complexity and smaller size SMEs, all the way to a strongly independent board of directors for SMEs that may even be listed on a local stock exchange. So you can see in this ladder, we have two axes. We have the size and complexity of the business, and we have the ownership structure. These are two of the big parameters that help design the appropriate oversight, the nature of the appropriate oversight body. And as you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, when you have a very small, low complexity type of business where the founder is the main owner, usually you have a paper board, even with only the family of the owner. But it's, in my view, a good idea to have an advisory board, so you can also benefit from the input from people who are not necessarily family members. And then going all the way to the right-hand top corner, where you have large, high complexity businesses and are listed, then there you need to have a strongly independent board of directors with non-executives that are not related to the business and can provide real oversight.
What is a paper board, please?
A paper board is what I would call a rubber stamp board that basically doesn't really discuss anything. It is there mainly for regulatory reasons. Every company needs to have some kind of body that signs off certain things. And very often you find that in the early stages of a company, this function, this duty is dealt with by a small group of people who are related to the founder, and they just simply meet once a year and sign whatever papers need to be signed so they can be submitted. But I think that is, as I said, that's the
early stage.
Yeah, that's a very early stage.
When it comes to SMEs, they usually perceive corporate governance as being something for larger companies, something expensive, they don't really understand the value. And part of our mission is to introduce good business practices. So how could we convince them? How could we promote this idea to potential clients?
Well, I agree that some SMEs and their owners may indeed perceive corporate governance as something that is expensive and only relevant or necessary for large companies. And I would explain to SME owners that they're probably already practicing some elements of corporate governance without even describing it as such, as I have mentioned before, and encourage them to expand and codify it in order to have the full benefits of it. And I would also stress that corporate governance is an investment in a discipline that benefits their businesses and themselves as owners, because it helps make their businesses more resilient, more transparent, and as a result, potentially also more valuable.
Could we maybe talk a bit about what is the visibility of a good corporate governance? How does a successful corporate governance system looks like? What can be observed?
Yes, it is interesting because I call it it's an interesting paradox, because its purpose is to minimize risks to the survival and the prospects of a business. So essentially, an effective corporate governance is evidenced by the lack of crisis and existential threat to companies. So in a way, when corporate governance is doing its job, it's not so visible. On the other hand, when you see a crisis or an existential threat or a failure, it is usually a sign that corporate governance was probably absent or ineffective. I like to use a little bit the analogy of refereeing in football, in soccer. When the referee is doing his job or her job, you hardly notice them. When they start showing yellow cards and sending players off from both sides, they've lost control of the game.
So it's a good time to show you a slide on the corporate governance failings and pitfalls for SMEs?
Most common typical corporate governance failings in SMEs is that in an SME, very often everything is decided by the founder owner. And this, of course, can affect decision making, because sometimes the decisions may not be made when they should be made, or they're made without sufficient information. There's also the risk that you end up with one key person, and if something happens to this key person and there's no succession planning or other structures in place, then the company can experience some real challenges. Another pitfall is that there is no code of conduct and there's no escalation mechanism for issues as they arise. And so that in effect means that the employees have to improvise when they're faced with some challenge or some dilemma. And sometimes they'll make the right decision, but sometimes they'll make the wrong decision, and that can expose the company as well. Another typical sort of pitfall in corporate governance in SMEs is that the culture that is set from the top is not appropriate. And if they're not committed to corporate governance, if they send a signal that the rules are not for us but for other people, then that will undermine governance, and ultimately it will undermine the standing of the company with stakeholders. Another one is that there could be weak or ineffective controls or not sufficient monitoring and reporting, and that again can create risks for the company and the people. And finally, a typical pitfall is this notion that corporate governance is an expensive luxury, or we just have to tick some boxes and then we're done with it. I think that again is a typical pitfall that you find, that people do it, but they do it half-heartedly, they don't do it for the right reasons, and they don't get the benefits from it. So that is part of it.
Thank you. Let's maybe talk a bit about family-owned businesses who think about introducing corporate governance. So in a typical family business, you might have different generations and involved, and parents, grandparents, grandchildren, cousins, and they can be employees or managers or directors or owners of the business. How do we find a way to keep it all together? Should we think about corporate governance and family governance at the same time?
Yes, I believe that it's important to think about family governance when it comes to family-owned businesses, because of exactly what you said, the multiple roles that family members play in a family business, and the interactions that they have between them and the business require some discipline and some structure. Because in a family business, in addition to the normal business risk, there's also the risks that come from these interactions between the family members themselves and between the family members and the business. For example, if there are differences between the family about certain things, they can affect negatively the business. And also there is the risk that if the business issues and challenges can create conflict within the family itself and tear it apart. So that's why I feel in family-owned businesses, corporate governance is necessary, like in any other business, but you also need family governance. It's a little bit like, having two legs. You go a lot further rather than if you just try and walk on one leg. And family governance practiced well can act as a shock absorber to help mitigate these risks that arise from these interactions, and to make sure that the interaction between the family and the business is a constructive one. And family governance can also help keep a family united and focused. And in many ways, family governance mirrors corporate governance, as you need to put in place arrangements that are similar as what you would do in corporate governance. In family governance, you have the family assembly, which is where the family gathers to identify who are going to be in the family council. And it is the family council that then nominates candidates to go onto the board of directors, and also who represent the family in the shareholders assembly. And of course, there are other structures like a family office that deals with family investments and committees of the family. So in a way, you can see that they're quite similar, but there's a link to make sure, and the link is structured in a way to make sure that it is done in a disciplined way.
Last question from me. Could you maybe summarize the top 5 do's for families owning SME businesses? What should they focus on?
We need to recognize that there are costs, but there are also benefits from corporate and family governance, and therefore they should treat it as an investment. They shouldn't treat it as simply a cost. They should recognize the benefits and recognize it's a journey and early. Introduce corporate governance and family governance as early as you can afford to do that, and recognize that actually it has a lot of dimensions and you will continuously to evolve and you continuously improve. So it is something that you will constantly be practicing and constantly getting better at. The third recommendation that I have is widen the pool of the team, of the managerial resources that you have at your disposal by including non-family members at the earliest opportunity. Don't just rely on the family members, but expand the pool of talent that you can use for your business. And when you do that, also think about how you're going to motivate these non-family members, possibly by introducing proper incentives. The fourth is to utilize all the dimensions of corporate governance and to consider that this, as we said, is a dynamic journey and not a destination. And finally, in relation to family governance, to enhance the prospects of longevity of the business, use all the dimensions, and don't forget the family business carries the family name, and therefore you have a responsibility to those who came before and those who came after, and in a way will come after. And in a way, I think of it as an acorn that grows a very big tree and with multiple branches and keeps growing.
This was a really good summary, and it's obvious that corporate governance is relevant for SMEs. Thank you very much once again. Now we have this wealth of knowledge to think about and process. Let's hope our efforts will help introducing good corporate governance practices in your countries. Thank you, Christos.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for tuning in today to Corporate Governance for SMEs. BRD provides finance and advice to SMEs and also brings relevant content to you, so be sure to subscribe to our channels. If you would like to work with us, please contact your local office or the HQ. The contacts are on the screen. Thank you.